Let me read to you a passage from the 4th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, verses 24 to 30. It's the Gospel for Monday of the 3rd week of Lent. St. Luke writes, Jesus said, I tell you the truth. No prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him down the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. That's from Luke chapter 4, verses 24 to 30. What does it suggest to us? Well, it suggests thoughts about the sin, and what we might call the good. What do I mean? Well, there are currents of philosophical thought which regard objective morality as a phantom. The good, meaning that which is morally good, is deemed to be nothing more than the preferable, or the most useful, or the most in accord with aesthetic taste, or whatever. In terms of objective reality, the good and the ought are reducible to whatever happens to be the fact. Mere facts are all that there are, and any contours of a moral character in these facts are simply one's subjective reactions. Hence there is no objective moral system, absolutely speaking. Now this view is remarkable because just as the sheer fact of reality and the world is evident, so is the good and the ought evident. Duty is a fact of life just as much as houses and other material things. If any theory does not accept the manifest moral phenomenon of duty, then it is difficult to know how to proceed in the discussion. John Henry Newman, in his study of the nature of faith, the Grammar of Assent, states that he begins with the fact that we have a conscience. This to him is evident, which is to say that the objective moral realm is evident, even if it is not clear whether this or that proposed course of action is morally obligatory. But now, granted the manifest fact that there are objective moral obligations, the next striking feature of human life is that moral obligation can be calmly and absolutely rejected. The good and the ought can easily be avoided, flouted, ignored, greatly weakened and crushed. It is possible for a man to set out on a lifelong course of rejecting the ought and even destroying it. His mind and heart will become blinded and depraved by his rejection of the ought, and this will lead him to reject the ought the more. The destruction of the human being is set in train especially, most especially, by his rejection of what is morally good and his acceptance of what is morally bad. We might keep healthy by good exercise and a proper diet, but our fundamental and everlasting health is determined by our response to the ought, what ought be done. The great issue in life and history is the human response to what is good. We see this encapsulated in our gospel passage today from Luke chapter 4 verses 24 to 30. Our Lord is speaking to his own townspeople. He stands before them in the synagogue, having returned from his developing prophetic ministry in Judea and Galilee. They had heard about it, for the fame of our Lord had gone forth throughout the country. While during his years growing up in Nazareth, his true nature and incomparable grandeur would not have been suspected, which shows, by the way, the strength and completeness of the incarnation. His relatives and townsmen must have seen a little of the great goodness of his life. They must have understood something of his immense probity, and we see something of this in John the Baptist's response when our Lord presented himself to him for baptism. "It is you who ought to be baptizing me," he said to Jesus. And Jesus did not deny it, but asked that the baptism proceed, for it was fitting in view of God's plan. John the Baptist knew Christ's goodness of life, and, as I've just said, presumably his townsmen in Nazareth also divined something about it, something of it. So there he stood, speaking to them in the synagogue, the very good man whom they knew so well. All their eyes were upon him. But what happened? When the ought was presented to them, they rebelled and attempted to crush it. Our Lord's own person embodied all of moral grandeur and all that was morally required. The ought was that they accept his person and his teaching and revelation that he was the promised Messiah. But they refused to do what they ought to have done. Our Lord could read their hearts and warned them by pointing to similar instances in the Scriptures. They would be passed by if they did not change. "I tell you the truth," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." The people of Nazareth, at least a significant section of them, attempted to kill our Lord. It was an omen of what was to come, and it manifested the mystery of sin. We are able to apprehend clearly that the good ought be done and evil ought be avoided, but we are also able to disregard this fundamental natural law. We disregard and flout it in its particular embodiments. The fullest and most perfect embodiment of the good and of the ought is the person of Jesus Christ. We can accept him in love and faith, or we can reject him. A striking instance of the rejection of him occurred not long into his public ministry, when the people in his own town attempted to do away with him. Let us take heed then and preserve our hearts for Jesus Christ, resisting any tendency to dally with sin and evil.